Want to open up for questions?
Going back to your green card model in the solicitation of feedback, how do you address closing the loop and coming up with a different decision?
Can everybody hear? Sorry, can everybody hear? Should we repeat it? I'll bring a microphone back.
Yeah. So I think the question was in the green card example, right? How do we close the loop and
so obviously after the opinions, it wasn't the popular decision. So how do you go back and readdress the situation? So
I think what everyone wants to do when it comes to decision making, I think in the military you call it is it the MDMP, the military decision making process, right? You kind of want a formula of how to do this. And this is the part about judgment and intuition. There is no formula, but I'll tell you what happened in this case. So we sat and read it, right? Like, I mean, oh my God, they don't understand. I mean, angry at first, right? It's a process of digesting the feedback. We always say, bring the truth to light. You have to be able to put it in front of you. Usually not alone, because that's easy to just kind of ignore or dismiss or blame yourself for it, which is called rumination. But instead, put it on the table together, look at it. But you need to create some space. It might even be an overnight sleep. It might be a workout. It might just be a walk around the block. Then revisit it, because the pearls of wisdom in it, you can see once the fire's dying down a little bit. When you usually see critical feedback, I always say we're like a ball of charcoal that's filled with gasoline. You light it on fire, it just goes. But before you know it, it dies down. It's still hot. But that's when you can make sense of it and find the pearls of wisdom. So we look through and we found the pearls of wisdom, but we weren't quite certain. So then we called for a town hall with the foreign nationals, anyone who wanted to attend. And we shared the feedback we got, right? Honestly, it wasn't easy to process. We shared. And then we talked through, once again, my assumptions, the data we took, the approach we took to process it, and then shared what we saw here, and then had a discussion there, got more feedback afterwards. In that case, actually, it turned out positive. That let us make the right calls. But it's not always so fast. Sometimes it takes more iterations. Another question?
Charlie, thanks for having us out today. First thing, there were several of us here who noticed that some of the questions we had asked about 30 seconds prior to you standing up there was on a printout in your hand. So the OODA loop in the office is incredible.
Thank you.
That's amazing. So one of the questions I brought up to your team has specifically to do with your feedback process. And sitting in a command position, quite often we find ourselves wondering, have I built an environment where I'm going to get blunt and honest feedback? And so I think your solution was to apply an anonymous standard to that, to get that blunt and honest feedback. How much time did you spend thinking about, am I the reason I'm not getting blunt, honest feedback? And then the question I'd asked your team was, does that electronic anonymity, that shield that they have, prevent your team members from growing in a way that will allow them to give critical and blunt, honest feedback? Or does it prevent that? Does it stagnate that growth?
Can I maybe just start maybe in the reverse order? I'll just make a comment on, does the electronic feedback actually make it harder? Do they
So you don't see more face-to-face.
Give less face-to-face direction.
Yeah, and the response I got from your team, I'll tell you, was, well, there's a good mix. Some of us use it as a springboard, some of us don't.
If you came to our Leadership Academy on feedback, your mind will be blown at the level of face-to-face feedback that's given small groups, large groups, from people who are 20 years work experience to someone who's been here 1 month, has been trained. It will blow your mind. And you have to see it to almost.
I think it's actually counterintuitive. Actually practicing is, because it's frequently practicing, the consistent practice is what develops muscle in anything. The practice of giving feedback in an anonymous app where you have psychological safety, by the time you then go and try speak up in person, you're more likely to do it. So the answer is actually we're getting more open, honest, critical feedback. I wouldn't necessarily say eye to eye. I think it's a whole other stream of thinking around actually why people walk together side by side in cars and traveling will actually give each other more critical feedback, have those tough conversations than face to face. There's a whole other psychology behind that, but we're getting a lot more because people are more practiced at it. It's just like anything. All of a sudden, it's like kind of like the Karate Kid, paint the fence, sand the floor. All of a sudden, you realize you've been practicing. You don't quite know all the reasons why but you're more likely to do that as opposed to not. In the beginning, I think, without question, people in the beginning, they're afraid to, but it's a great practice ground. So I think ironically, we found that it does the opposite.
There's a lot of introverts in every company. And we found that, especially for a lot of introverts, in fact, when you think of diversity, the greater the diversity, it's even harder to speak up. And so you'll find those populations are the ones who go most silent. And so they needed a way to start somewhere. Would you rather have something or nothing? And so what we heard was this: the anonymous app was the easiest way to start. Because by the way, you and your phone, nobody knows who said that. Yet, here's what's interesting. It's anonymous, but it's not stranger in the internet. It's within a known group. We'll know it's someone in this room or somewhere in our company. And everyone can see what they wrote, but they can't tell who wrote it. And it's fascinating because you can see who was given the feedback. You can't see who said it. It was to protect the psychological safety and the courage to actually speak up was really hard. The processing of it is a whole other thing. Most organizations train people to first, how do you receive feedback? And then how do you solicit and seek feedback? And then you find no one's willing to give it. So the courage, except for maybe the few senior people who do all of it, which is this heavy imbalance most companies find. So we found the anonymous gave them the first stepping stone. Then people said, oftentimes I end up using email as my second level, and then I'll level up to face-to-face. Some of us are just better, maybe can jump straight to, not better, but jump straight to face-to-face. I say better cautiously because I thought I was better. I realized how bad I was. But the practice ground, it's like the leveling is very important. The history of kind of how we got to anonymous was this. We had a bunch of different things in the HR side. And being engineering oriented, we did something that was unusual. If you look at companies with sales or engineering, they always say, launch quickly, iterate like hell. Fail fast, fail forward. You may have heard all this. But can you imagine in the field of human resources hearing that phrase? Fail fast, fail quickly, right? Fail forward. It's more like compliance, legal, right? I mean, this is what... So we took an engineering mindset and approach against HR. And trust me, we had some really bad things that happened in the process, which I usually drove a lot of that, and paid the price for it heavily. But, right? but in doing that, we first tried it because I used to always believe what a lot of people say: if you give feedback, you should have your name attached to it, right? Have the courage, have the chutzpah to have your name attached, right? No feedback should come without a name. So we did that. And we had comments at things that happened, and we announced that people could give feedback. And what we found was it was mostly fluff. It's what our head of engineering called zero-calorie feedback. It wasn't really helpful in many ways. So one day as an experiment, we said, what would happen if you made it anonymous? Same thing, right? Took it out. And it was like, boom, there was this explosion of truth. We're like, that was always there, but not until anonymous did that show up. Our app is built, we took this cue from the nuclear football. Maybe it's because you're working with the military. The only way to unlock who gave the feedback is a password that requires, from Tom, Megan, and I, we each have a third of the password. So unless we three agree, no matter what, you're not going to be able to unlock who gave the feedback. So we protect that person's, identity that much. But we found, if you want the truth, you're going to need to find the tool to do that. Sorry, I think someone had a question here first, right? Or, okay, all right. Here, I'll give you this one.
Okay. Thanks both of you for having us here. So I know you have a tremendous amount of confidence in your leadership program, and obviously it's verifiable through your success. You have 150 employees, is that correct, in the company?
There's 100 plus full-time and 100 contractors, so
okay.
200 total.
Okay, so can you talk to us a little bit about, with a company that has a no firing policy, obviously the identification of talent and character is pretty important. Even though you believe that who you hire through your leadership training, you can get them there. But I'm very interested in your company with a no firing policy, your screening procedures to make sure you get it right.
Oh, yes. So first I would say, do not ever do a no firing policy until you get your hiring policies fully done right. Right. And so what was fascinating, I have to kind of take you back so we initially started college recruiting in 2006. So much later in the history of our company. And we went and brought on an investor who was the first angel investor in Google. And he was on the board of Amazon in Bezos' growth years for Amazon, and then has been the main board member of Google. And we brought him on for one reason as an investor. We wanted to know how to hire engineers. We got the help of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley investment bankers, and brought this guy on board and took capital from him simply because we wanted to pick his brain in the hiring process. And he said the key to hiring for both Google, Amazon, most of Silicon Valley was you hire stunningly brilliant, driven people. So we took that process, and the process was this thumbs up, thumbs down, 11 interviews, a maybe does not occur, and only unanimous 11 thumbs ups gets hired. We did this process, and we hired virtually perfect GPA students out of MIT, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, Georgia Tech. I mean, amazing schools. 2 years goes by in 2008, so before the financial crash, and we see something wasn't right. We didn't know how to put our finger on it. Half the group, all hired under the same criteria of brilliantly, highly driven, stunningly brilliant, right? Half the group you like working with, the other half just hated working with. They were awful. And we had 80 engineers at that point. And we went through and put them all in little Post-it notes and separated them. And as a senior team, just started separating and finding the common patterns into 2 buckets. The pattern we didn't like had all types of things, like when they made mistakes, they always found other people to blame. They never learned lessons. They were terrible team players. All these characteristics. Then we looked at the other group, hired under the same criteria, that actually were great to work with. And when we summarized all the traits, we said they have humility. Now, not meekness, but the open-mindedness, like that they might not be right, to take what we call investments in loss, right? And get better and push harder, play out of the comfort zone. So we actually went, and this is one of the mistakes I made on the HR side. I fired 40 people in one day. And what I learned was you hire for humility, you must let go for dignity, which I didn't do. Pay the price for over a decade through a site called Glassdoor, and they still shred us to pieces. Very, very bad to do. But we fired them, and we kept the group we had. And so for the longest time, we kept screening under this driven, smart, competent metric plus humility. And it paid off in great ways. But then something happened in the last several years. The internet has gone so fast in taking every interview question imaginable up there. Candidates came in, and we had these recruiting events where people said the answers were like perfect. But like it's eerie, like it was like too
really
perfect.
Want to grow, and I love to help others. Like better me, better you. Yeah, that's it. And it was crazy. And they're just memorizing.
And they were flipping through pages saying, I have an answer to that one. We're like, what do you mean you have an answer? They knew every question we were going to ask and every way to answer it right or wrong. And we saw that interviews no longer work. So going back, I guess it's a full year now. We made a bold move around a year and a half ago to ditch all interviewing. And we put them in collaborative team exercises. You're meeting with pre-screen is still stunningly brilliant, driven, and humility. But once you get past that, we had a recruiting event this past Saturday called Super Saturday. It's a few thousand candidates whittled down to the top 50. We get close to 10,000 applicants a year. We hire maybe like 10 or 15. So very hard to get in, right? We always say we would never get in. Thank God we started the company or started early, right? But so what we do is we put them in team challenges, collaborative exercises where they have, it's competitions for like iPads and really competitive stuff. It's a 10-hour interview day. You're sitting with strangers and you have 45-minute clock to kind of figure out this challenge and win this presentation you have to give for 3 minutes. But as you're doing it, it's very noisy. All next jumpers are hovering around, watching you and how you do this exercise. Are you speaking too much, too little? And feedback apping the whole thing that's happening. Then after the exercise is done, you write a self-eval of how you think you did. Then we give you what all the feedback anonymously is. 20 to maybe 40 data points on you within 45 minutes that we saw. And you have to read it, right? Then we let you go again in the same team. And we're screening for coachability. How much you improve when you get the second time. In the Marines in Paris Island, I think they call it the confidence course. When I saw that giant obstacle course, and I was like, how the hell is this a confidence course? They're like, because the second time, they do better. So we wanted to see the coachability level of individuals. And that was a much better metric to tell a future and how well they will succeed. But having said this, we took a philosophy of what the Marines did too. You say you can make anyone a Marine, but not everyone will become a Marine. Anybody who comes through, we can coach and train them. And when we did the no firing policy, we went through a 6-month exercise of the leadership saying, if we couldn't press the button of terminate, but could press every other lever, hire better, onboard better, even if they didn't work out how to help them leave on their own terms better, everything in between and development better, what would it look like? And in 2012, in the fall, we launched it. And it's been amazing. But lessons we learned was, we always use the analogy of if your child came home, had C's, right? Yeah. It's time for adoption, right? This is it, right? I got to go make a new one. Versus, no, you're going to coach them. You're going to coach them, make them better. And that constraint forced us to get better at figuring out development and leadership. And then you mentioned that we have confidence and stuff. We talk about, we think we're at the 5 to 10% mark of understanding how to do this. We can't even see the halfway point. We think the development of people, it's so not understood that when you say confident, it's, we're grateful for that kind of comment, but we're like at such an early stage, we can't even see the halfway point yet.
I think what's maybe indicative of that, we spend a lot of time together. We work in the same office. We're partners. We make decisions together. Sometimes we think, wow, we really figured, and then we have discussion like, I've known you for 20 years. How did I not? And the messy human process of development, as much time as we spend on it, we're so far behind. It's every day we're recognizing these gaps and things we hadn't thought of before. I think it's because human beings are so complex. They say everybody's psychotic. They say everyone is schizo. We all are. And so figuring that it's like so far from being figured out.
Right. That was actually one of the best things we heard from this educator. Said, human beings by nature are schizo. We don't like to admit it. You have your best self, when you say your best versions of yourself and when your best self shows up, but you also have your worst self. And yes, you'll excuse it to the days you haven't slept. Maybe you're, something bad happened, but the reality is both are true. And the gap between the two is what they call integrity. And integrity isn't a fixed state. It's a moving, trending state where the more you work on closing the gap, you are of higher integrity trending. And the more you leave it alone, you are of lower and lower integrity trending. So there's a lot of work on this.
Thank you.
Question over there somewhere? Can we get a mic? We'll give you this mic too after. Or you have one? Oh.
Something you said with your Super Saturday, and then when we went on the tour, all the collaborative work you do. Do introverts survive the Super Saturday, and how do they survive such a collaborative environment? Are you worried about squeezing them out?
It's so funny you say this. The discussion I heard in this Super Saturday, we have a war room afterwards where they make the hiring decisions. It's kind of a crazy thing, which you guys are welcome to come visit the next one and see it. Like they see all the data points, and they make decisions that day of who to hire, who not to hire. But they said after the war room, we're finally starting to hire arrogant people again. Meaning for the longest stretch, when it came down to coachability, humility, we missed out on the other side. We started missing the extroverts. We started not hiring extroverts, the overly confident, because they seemed harder to coach. So we had the opposite of what you actually were saying. So they literally were like relieved. Oh, finally, we're adding them back in. We're hiring more of them. So we were hiring a lot of fish for a while.
Where we are right now, Charles.
Another question?
Yeah, just thanks for having us. It's been great, eye-opening, I think, in a lot of perspectives and just aspect of how your company is running. Can you just expand a little bit on the 5 reasons we don't get signals? And so specifically, like the shit sandwich. And the reason I say that is because in the military, we're sort of, we're propped up on like, I give honest feedback. And when someone sucks, we tell them they suck. Right. And,
yes.
And so the care comes late and, sometimes never. And I don't know if that's like the right way to do it or not. But occasionally that happens. And so I'm just interested in either or both your thoughts on expanding on, really, it could be any of those reasons, but specifically maybe that one.
Okay. I'm going to show you this thing that actually will help. So there's an individual that came from Google by the name of Kim Scott. I think it's Kim Scott, right? So she did a talk at it's like first round or something. It's a tech group. It doesn't matter to you, but this is what she had to access. There's being direct, and they're showing care, right? So the best is what she called radical candor. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but so radical candor is when you can be direct, right? What they call tough love. Tough love usually is a signal of successful, right? Direct feedback. But if you don't do it right, you're direct, but you don't care. It's what they call obnoxious aggression. They also call this the asshole, right? Obnoxious aggression. Then in this quadrant where you are showing care but not direct, they call it ruinous empathy. And then over here is when it's manipulative insincerity. So I don't know if you've ever seen this, but right? So, we of course absolutely want to avoid this, right? Because this is the person where you always hit an agenda, right? No matter what they say, you're like, I know there's something else, right? Your feedback, usually this happens with spouses, right? A lot. Your feedback isn't really to help me. It's just to show me how much smarter you are than me or how much better you are. It's kind of what you might feel. It's not always the truth, but I try to explain to my wife that I'm just trying to do this, but she doesn't really. Oh, sure. Oh, thanks. Oh, sorry. I forgot we hired a Marine, so we. So this, of course, is what you want, right? Radical candor. But here is what we found, as most things in life. You know how they say love is not something you go directly for, just like happiness is not a direct path. It's an indirect path. If you try to find love, you won't find love. If you try to find happiness, you won't. It's a process that you have to shoot for something else, and it's an indirect path to it. So the choice you really have is this. Meaning you can choose to shoot for care as your primary choice or direct as your primary choice, willing to err on getting the other side wrong. So this is the real choice we all face. And the way I looked at it was, if you ever go to airports, right? Not airports, hotels, they have what they call the transit lounge, right? We found these spots are transit lounges. You don't stay in there forever. It ends up leading you somewhere else. We found that if you shoot for this, you always end up here in the eyes of other people. And if you shoot for this consistently and get the feedback, the second screen, you will eventually learn how to do it with care. So I don't know if this helps a little bit. But.
You know what's interesting though? I mentioned this to you yesterday. There was a summit we spoke at for the Air Force, and somebody came up to me right after and said, actually, I'm struggling with the exact opposite thing you guys were just talking about. I basically give obnoxious aggression all the time, and I just can't. I don't know how to show care. Like I'm just unable. And we talked about if that was true consistently, we would
should at first have no friends.
You have no friends, but the system ultimately would spit. I mean, you would. The
system will spit you out.
Happening consistently, and if you knew about it, you would correct eventually. Like there's something in there that over time, if you kept being obnoxiously aggressive consistently over time with truth, right? Yeah. You would get. Not to say that. I mean, this is in the history. Charlie had erred more on that side when I was terrified of when I first started working with him. But over time, as he got more truth from a fish, you start to correct. And so anyways, I think it's interesting because I think most companies, struggle with the opposite. They give the shit sandwich. I mean, somebody in the Air Force told me, they say, nice boots, you suck, nice boots, it's like the common. But I think without question, there's the other side, that people.
But I think if you look at, leaders who like beat their chest and how great they are doing this, and they kind of are that asshole, right? And by the way, the study was this was the best. And she said, what they learned the data from Google was this: the second best thing, if you cannot do radical candor, is to be an asshole, is what they found. Now, here's what happens. If you find people who are able to somehow succeed in their career still doing this, you'll find them to almost be like a gypsy. They need to keep moving to new teams and new groups. Right? If you ever see them stay in the same group and hold the same amount of influence and power doing this all the time, the team won't allow for it. So they need to move, right? Thank God you have the 2-year thing, right? You move, brand new people, you get to do it again. And maybe by the time it's too much, you move again. But even in the group, right, as small as the Marines or the what?
Maybe that is why that occurs more, maybe more because people do move around.
Yeah, but I think it's a very small world.
Yeah, I know the strategic reasons why.
But what I'm saying is this. I mean, the world's got a hell of a lot smaller now. When you find out someone was an asshole, it travels like that. Like, I mean, it's so fast. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe you know. Like, it travels so fast and your reputation will carry and follow you, right? But it's still hard for people to swallow. It's better to do this than to do this, because this will get you to the right place. But if you don't eventually learn how to do this, you'll end up in the same place, right? No one's going to follow you anyways. Question down there, sorry? Or whoever has the mic, I guess.
Thank you for having us here today. One of the things that I was thinking about as I listened to what you were talking about is today did not go the way that I thought it would when I arrived here. This was a very disruptive learning process, not in a bad way, in a very good way.
I was waiting for the punch.
I mean, you walk in here and I thought we were
take it.
I thought we were going to get something different until
Yeah.
I started listening to what's going on.
Yeah.
It's an engineering company that wears the mask of a company that brands itself in the human dimension, you know, quite critically, rather. And so I started thinking about what I do in the Marine Corps, you know, just giving up command of an infantry battalion. I wish I would have had this before I went there. And it's partly because a lot of us, where we are in our respective agencies and service, we recognize that our institution has to change. And we've got to adapt some new models. So a lot of what you talked about was adaptability and building high-powered learning teams. My question is, the education process, the change management techniques that you have had to apply to your organization to make this sustainable. I'd just be interested because I see ways that we might be able to use this even in a system that's very hierarchical.
I was going to answer it really quick. It's kind of funny. So we got to see the Eagle Globe anchor ceremony, a very emotional ceremony and whatnot. And as it's happening, I can't remember the sergeant or who's the guy with it. They all have hats, but CC, drill sergeant, he leans to me and says, "You can't do this anywhere except in the military." And I was like, "You should see what we do," right? And we don't use the physical side as much, but you know, the emotional, mental side. I mean, we are tough as nails. If you came and saw what we do, growth is very hard. To hear the truth and expose what we call the swamp is actually a very, very difficult thing to do. But you know what I was going to share that's kind of fascinating is this. You know, we have this phrase called better me, right? Plus better you equals better us. And we use this term from technology. It's called dog fooding. Technology, when you build anything software, they call it dog fooding because the first set you make tastes like dog food. And we always believe you make dog food and you have to try it first. And then for your guests, you serve things that eventually get better, which is after moving out of dog fooding and beta. We lead by example and trust everything on ourselves first. We have a new idea, Megan and I will try it first on ourselves before we bring it to our leadership team, and then we'll make it company-wide. And one of the mistakes that people make when dog fooding, right, is that they obsess on the language. Are we using the right words, right? Are we calling it the right thing? It's a little offensive the way you called it. For a while, we had a fitness program. I tried to get people who didn't go to the gym to go, and I call that the Catch a Whale program. It did not go over well.
I remember begging on my hands and knees, please stop this. Just one more week, Megan. One more week.
I ran it for 4 weeks just in case something could come out of it. Good.
But we actually used to call our onboarding Crucible.
Oh yeah, that did not go over well, right? Can you imagine an employee's parents, you know, perfect GPA person coming in saying, "Yes, I'm going to the Crucible, and I failed now for the 4th time in the Crucible." They're like, "The what? What are they doing to you? And are they hurting you physically?" We're like, no. So we now call it PLB, which is Personal Leadership Bootcamp, but it runs exactly like the Crucible. that we used to have. So language, though, in the beginning is not what you focus on. And almost everything, sequence matters. But you need to instead obsess on the intention. Like the North Star, the intention, what you're trying to get done. And forget and put placeholder language. In fact, I always say put language in brackets. So we call it like the crucible in brackets, saying it's a temporary name, we'll find a permanent name. But instead, what we're trying to do though, right? And you explain the intention. But here's what we found. So we have a giving gene just kind of baked right from the beginning in the DNA of the company. So even 10 years ago, starting culture tours and sharing our expertise of everything we had learned, every mistake we made, we started sharing, even the mistakes. We haven't figured this one out, but here's what we made multiple repeated mistakes on. And as we shared what we made mistakes on, what we did, the reaction we found when we were teaching. So this is when we were students ourselves, and this is when we were teachers. We found that the outside rejected anything that didn't have the right language. So the act of teaching made us have to focus on getting the language right, because organizations that we were putting our time and money into were rejecting things we were doing simply because we had the wrong language, despite it doing all the right things. So this ended up helping us get our language stronger, where a lot of people come and say, wow, what you're doing is so based in research and the way you talk about the why and the how and the what and all this stuff. And instead, what happened was we were sharing all the dogfooding we're doing and saying, here's what didn't work, what worked. And they would say, you know what you're doing, Charlie, is you're doing what they called organizational silence or research. And we'll say, what do you call it again? And we'll write it down. And next time we'll be like, so once we figured out how to break organizational silence, people are like, wow, how do you do that? The language, here's what's interesting part. As we did this better, we changed the language internally, which then turned the whole thing we're doing more deliberate and got greater adoption by our own people and the people who influence them, spouses, children, families. They did it better, which then let us teach it better, and the whole cycle got better. But that was an important sequence that we got there by accident. But then we saw other organizations make the mistake. You can't launch it because you haven't gotten the language right. You're sitting now coming up with drafts and drafts and drafts of the document, the brief, right? And you won't start the program till you get the language right. Versus start and just have the intention. If it can be a diagram, just put a placeholder word. But you'll see when you want to teach it to other people, they will not adopt it unless the language is right. No? Good? No?
My question's at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about decision-making and making everyone capable of being a decision maker. Can you talk about the second and third order effects of that and how you've worked through, it's pretty hard to go back to like counting cables, for instance, after you've been a decision maker. Can you talk through how you iterated through that?
Yeah. So actually, that's an excellent question. So here's hope you can see all this. If you think of this as where you are now, right? I should actually follow my own thing. I'll do the blue dots, right? So this is where you are now, the blue dot, right? Think of this as mission. And then we think of what's down here as practice. Now, in our world, we don't call it mission, even though we probably should, but we just call it revenue. So what ends up happening is up here, you cannot afford to underwrite a lot of risk, right? It costs a lot. So underwriting risk up here is very costly. Said another way, you can't afford to make mistakes. Don't screw up. You're going to have to micromanage. And the reason why I drew the arrow is that if this is a job that what I call a plus 10 job versus this is a minus 10 job, meaning if my capability is here, that is way beyond what I am capable of doing versus this is really easy for me, right? And we took this from the military, you know, that those who get shot in training survive in war and those who actually never die in training tend to die at war. This is the place that's really important because You can underwrite risk over here. Exact same thing, but so you can, versus up here, you cannot. And so when you recognize that this is a place where you have to get it perfect. This you don't. The problem we found in most organizations, including the military, is you have to get everything perfect, right? We had this thing where we ran an academy and they have like this recognition ceremony, and a team was in charge of the photographing of with the general after, and the placement, the exact turn, and they were beating themselves over the tiniest of mistakes. And we're like, what, you can't underwrite the risk? They're like, no, because in the Air Force, we believe in excellence, right? We must be excellent at everything. And so guess what? As a result, they're not excellent at a lot of things, because if you shoot for perfect, you'll see it's like walking on eggshells everywhere. You need to be so perfect, you can't afford to take risk. There's a term, there's a guy, I don't know if I will give this book afterwards, that one of the people we met is a guy named Josh Wakeskin, world chess champion, became world martial arts champion. I love this phrase he gave us, which is what he called investments in loss. Now, his story of this investment in loss is kind of crazy so here's a guy, same age as me, 45. He lives in New York City. We spent quite a bit of time with him. And he became world chess champion. So that's kind of a pretty big feat, right? Then he decided to change gears completely and go from chess to become a world martial artist. So in Taiwan, there's a national sport called Tai Chi, and they have a tournament every 2 years. And this guy from Taiwan had held the title for 9 years. Josh Wakeskin goes in 6 years, trains, and becomes #1 in the world. Beats this guy. Wrote a book called The Art of Learning, which I think if we have it, we'll give you copies. I just said this, so Daryl's already getting copies for you. But he explained this process of how he went from one sport to another and what he called an investment in loss. And this is what investment in loss for him as a dorky chess kid to martial art looked like. He went to this dojo in New York, and this guy who should have been All-American at least, was just beating the living daylights out of him. So much that he would throw him up against the wall, and after months, you can see paint chipping on the wall from the very place Josh would hit every time. And he was convinced he would die. He'd never make it. But he had this day, the turning point day, where he's walking to the dojo and he says, oh my God, I'm not dead. I'm actually alive. And that day, it went from being fear-ridden, right? This guy's so fast, so big, I can't even see what he's doing. Same thing happens again. That day, he watched him. He's like, wait, he does the exact same move all the time. And that day, he beat him. And from that day onwards, that guy refused to fight Josh. And he said, that's what I call an investment in loss. This guy should have been at least national champion, but he can't invest in loss. So as a result of it, right, you never get better. Just playing out of your comfort zone. So what we found was this. Organizations that do decision-making right know how to find these -10 zones, right, and stress the hell out of it. Versus what you try to do usually is take this and try to make it easier, right? Now, you know what that looks like usually? I'll kind of do like 95% of the work and then give it to you and then give you credit because I'll be a good leader. Well done. No, that was all you. It was all you. You wrote the last 3 words of that brief. It was all you. The micromanagement, the coddling, the giving credit when credit isn't due notion, you're trying to make the mission easier. And the problem with mission, this area is such the red zone, you can't touch it to make it, it's hard to toy with this thing. And this is so complex. VUCA is much greater here than down here. This is much easier. And how do you stress it out? Less time, less budget, less resources, right? And then, people go into oh my God, but I'm trying to think of it's crazy what people will do. And to add another quick story, if you don't mind, is, so another lesson from Josh was this. We asked him, I asked him monkey style. So how do you become best in the world in chess? Right? What's the trick? There must be a trick or two, right? And so he says, actually, it wasn't as hard as you think. He created this phrase that I like. He called it you is you. You are, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And how he beat his opponents was this. He said at the poker table, chess is like poker. Everyone needs to bring patience and discipline. Everyone's bluffing. But the truth of who they are shows up away from the game, away from the table, away from the game. He had a little black book. He would follow his opponents around at the tournament. And he would give them a patience score from 1 to 4. So if they're in the buffet line, if they're tapping the foot, anxious for the buffet, you get a different patience score than when you're patient. You look at the elevator, how many times they pressed the elevator button gave them a different patience score. He used that to beat them. So when we learned that, we're like, wait a sec. So not only can you get better self-awareness, self-evaluation of people away from the game, you can train them in that. And when you do, it will show up here. It's exactly what we found. As you train here, it will show up here. There's an executive from one of the biggest financial companies. He's like the number 2 in the company. We trained him how to get more patient by doing one simple thing. When he walks to meetings, he always charges in front first, and everyone follows. We said, from now on, you will walk in the back. I know you're worried about the meeting being late, but you know what? You're the head guy. Don't worry. Just walk in the back and deliberately do this. And when you do this for 90 days, by day 91, you should be potentially changed. The first people who usually see a change in you will be at home. Usually spouses and children. He called us back and said one day, he's like, it's so weird. My spouse said, what are you doing? Like, you're different. What happened to you, right? Like, you know, when they walk, he's walking slower and he's just more patient. You have the ability to change who you are by changing. There's this other thing. Sorry, I'm throwing so much at you guys, but there's a piece of study that says that 5% of us is what they call willpower. 95% of who we are rituals, what we do consistently, not intensely. When you change the big pie, you will see where it really matters. The important stuff changes too. So, I don't know who asked the question, but does this kind of answer your question a little bit? Sorry, I can digress a little bit. Very good.
I'm trying not to come across as the obnoxious aggression here, but first of all, fantastic day. In 3 months, I think have been absolutely fantastic instruction. This is one of the finer events I've been to, so I'll echo Reggie's comments. But you said you recently hired 40 people.
No, we fired 40 people.
You fired, okay, but
where's it? 2008.
Your Super Saturday that you recently had.
Oh, and hired 10.
You hired
10 as of Saturday night, and there's 8 follow-ups, but yes.
What is your turnover rate? And
So
based upon that, there may be another question. How often do people come and go here?
When you say come and go, what do you mean?
I mean,
like
you just hired 10 out of 150 full-time. So what, you know, the Marine Corps turns over 62% a year average. But what do you turn over annually?
So right now the turnover is very low, like low single digits. Like the company, but I'll to maybe better help answer the question and give you a little more context time-wise. So when we started hiring, the reason why most New York companies didn't invest in hiring from college campuses was because it's so hard to compete. And so our board member, the guy Ron from Google, told us, move to San Francisco. You can't compete for engineers here. So instead we said, okay, let's just take a contrarian approach. Like if we decide to stay here, what we have to do, so invest in college recruiting, all this stuff. But he said it will take 4 or 5 years, it's not worth trying. Well, it took us 4 years of full-on college recruiting and investing a ton before we became one of the top 3 recruiters out of the top East Coast schools only. So MIT, Cornell, Carnegie Mellon, and Georgia Tech. But the year we became number 1, 2010, we had very little turnover up to that point. Almost overnight, our turnover shot up to 40%. And the individual we had hired at 21 for a 6-figure salary of 21 was being, so 100,000 base at 21 was being offered 2 to 3 times that number within 6 to 12 months to move. Startups had funds, but no engineers, and they heard we had done all the screening and trained them, and they were poaching them at a rate of roughly 6 solicitations a week was what an average engineer was getting. And by the way, the competition for engineers has only gotten more fierce. So for 2 years, literally nothing seemed to budge. I mean, you can't fight with that kind of money. And so we were just watching the door like a revolving door. Every hire we made, we're just going out as fast. But we realized we couldn't fight with money, so we actually decided from way back and just kept investing in, which is the currency of education. Not education. Most people like more TED Talks, more this, but this notion of learning how to be a better decision maker, take responsibility, have judgment. And we baked that in, and we found that it took around 5-6 years before someone was trained well enough. And granted, we were not as good then as we are now. We got much better. And At 2012, this is before even the no firing policy occurred in October, but the turnover almost overnight dropped to low single digits, virtually disappeared like February, March of that same year, because the first college hires that we had trained started to go into leadership roles. And people were like, oh my God, they mean what they said. They were training us to actually do these things and they're giving us responsibility. And when that happened, it went from this huge turnover to like single digits, and it held since that point. So if that gives you a little history, and we realize you're not worth poaching if you don't have a lot of high quality talent. The density of your talent will result in more aggressive poaching of your talent. But we still have equally, if not higher, aggressive of talent, but this got stronger and stronger. Our development of them, and then the use of that, right? So the one way that we talked about the better you, we got from the military, we call it touch the mission, right? Touching the mission is very important, but most people touch the mission too few times. Meaning we found that intensely you had to touch the mission. There were intense things like once a year, once a quarter, even once a month, but then there were a lot more consistent things that occurred daily, weekly, and even monthly. And the combination of that was important for people to feel what this is. I know this helps a little bit or not.
No, it did. I was under the impression you were losing more. And I was going to ask you why. If this place is that great, why was the high turnover there? And apparently you had fixed that. So if I can just, one follow-on question, please, is the Marine Corps, the DOD, please.
I was going to say, so the turnover before 2012 was, so going up to this point was all like just you can't, it's more money. The turnover after them was all have to do with development is very hard. Growth is really, really hard. And the hardest part of growth is what we call the swamp. Processing the swamp. In fact, we have this whole framework we just built more recently. We're going to share it, but we thought it was too early.
But in short, the people who are leaving now are the ones who are having such a hard time where they're stuck. When we say every good sports team, you're going to have a bench. But there is shame and embarrassment that comes with being on the bench. But everybody goes to the bench, especially in business where every day is game day. In your world, every day is game day. You don't have a day where you get, and so naturally you're going to hit, this, what we call the swamp, but people don't want to go into it. It's to understand why you're stuck and what's happening and what's holding you back. It takes a lot of self-awareness, and a lot of people, you come close to that and who you are and why you're stuck. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to get to the other side of the swamp. And so we've had people who have left because I think that it is a hard process, and you're developing and growing yourself, not in the privacy of you, in front of others. It's a team, it's a company. And I think a lot of people just want to develop in private, which there are ways to do that in private in small teams. You probably heard our TP program, and we're paired up in teams of 2, but it's still very hard.
And that matches some critiques online of you all, Glassdoor.com. The vast majority that I read was they left because they just can't.
But that is all because that Glassdoor entire thing is none of Megan. It's all me. It's me doing my worst of monkeying you can imagine.
But even
CEO,
now, if there are people on there too, though, there's some pieces.
But it still stems from
hard.
Things that, once again, dog fooding, rough language that isn't refined and whatnot. But I think
you go back, I think it'll probably into it. So what the Marine Corps, DOD at large, is wrestling with is the Millennium Generation, and maybe what we're doing in the past to create grit in our Marines. You name the service. We may have to change doing that because the raw material we're getting is different. So you've been around 20 years, it says, a startup. Have you changed the way you identify that, or do you just continue to go out to that same? You know what I'm saying? So we need to change the product we're looking for to mold, or did you do that as you saw this change in the swamp, or did you see that? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no. I want to pose. That's the thing that we had. I'll read it. The whole thing that we just read, that we tweeted this thing. Oh, so we just sent this out. It was on Twitter. We just put it out there. This is what we share with our staff. I'll just put it out. It says, you want to do more good, learn to make a shitload of money. If you want growth, get good at grit. You want to be badass, train to be badass. You want to get to your destination faster, figure out where you are faster. If you want joy, get good at processing sorrow. You want to learn how to get in the zone, as in growth. Learn to get out of the swamp, as in grit. If you want to succeed, learn to get the truth faster. This is the hardest part for everyone. We all think about the growth zone, and we found that the growth zone is it's like the pressing window. It's very small in our lives. The window when you shoot a basketball, you feel like everything's on fire. Everything you throw in there just hits. This is very small. The majority of life is spent in the grind. Nothing is changing, and it's like dealing with just issue upon issue. And your inability to process this quick, and this is the most counterintuitive move people could understand.
But can I be for you? Because I think what you're asking maybe is more tied to sort of the older generation thinking, we've built this and this works, and the credibility that that it has worked, that whatever the Marines has done has worked. And I think that's the hardest part, I think, for the older generation, say in the Marines or in any service in any company, what we have done to get here to date has clearly worked, or else we wouldn't be here. But then there's this new generation of people who are coming in saying that doesn't quite work anymore. And they say, we just wrote this up, as in ditch it. The brief we sent you guys, if you get a chance to read it, we've been working, is saying ditch that because it doesn't work anymore.
I mean, all of us in this group are probably motivated by that quote.
Yeah.
I'm not sure too many 19-year-olds are motivated by that quote. I don't know how many 19-year-olds right now want to fight through the swamp.
Right.
Oh,
right?
no. All 19-year-olds want this more than ever before.
What?
Yeah, but
Growth. Right?
Yeah.
When you go on Instagram, you go on Facebook, it looks like everyone you ever knew in college is a millionaire on stage, wrote a book. I mean, they are feeling envy at levels you cannot imagine, right? They want this so badly. They may not tell you, but they're looking at it every day, right? Feeling inferior by the day.
Wanting it and suffering to get it are two different things.
But if you tell them the way to get here is this is you cannot get here without learning how to do this, because you're going to hit way too many swamps. You're not going to be able to press. The analogy I used was like our partner in Boston, Greg, plays water polo a lot. So when you throw a ball above the water polo is good, but try to throw the ball when you're underwater with the ball. You can't even throw it. You need to be able to get your head above water and you constantly, because life is pushing you underwater. And then when the time is right, you can throw the ball. But learning how to process this is very hard. And the most counterintuitive move is this point right here, rock bottom. That rock bottom is the birthplace of when you start to move out.
But you're touching on something that's really interesting, because without question, we've had employees who don't want to go into the swamp. Why does it have to be so hard? Can't I just skip that and get great? And I think there's two things I would say to that. One is modeling mistake making, because to say I went through the crucible 10 years ago or 20 years ago, to talk about the shit I've gone through here, nobody wants to hear that, right? They're like, I don't care. I'm a younger generation and I don't have to, I started locally selling door to door, a print guidebook. Well, I don't care, Megan. I don't have to do that. So I don't talk about that because they don't have to go through that now. It is a different world. I think we've recognized the need to model the mistake making more openly, which is actually very hard as leadership to put. We are in sessions, our workshops that we run, but we will argue in front of each other, in front of our people, with each other, modeling what it is when you're lost and stuck, because I think they need to see the newer us going through the swamp now, not that you have to. We don't share every level of it, but I think there's something in the relevance of
but here's a great story with Greg in Boston. So if you don't mind being vulnerable for Greg, I'll tell you the story. It's kind of cool. So Greg, when his oldest was going to first grade, this is a classic thing that we do of doing model mistake making, or kind of doing vulnerability wrong. So his first grader, Theo, was first day of first grade, didn't want to go, refused to go. So what does Greg do? Theo, when I was your age and I was going to first grade, I too was scared and blah, 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 blah. Theo still upset, not budging. That window, Greg was going through a swamp at work. He was doing really bad stuff. So he changed gears, literally on the spot, and said, Theo, I've been at Next Jump for almost 20 years. I am terrified of going to work right now. I am doing, and he literally just let out what's happening. Theo literally looked at him, got up, went to school. Even a kid that young can tell the truth, the difference between the truth and a coddling, like sort of the whole manipulative comment to try to make him go to school. When we say model mistake making, the senior version of that is scary as heck. The fact of your imposter syndrome, what you don't know. When we talk about ladders of inference and actually sharing the assumptions you're pulling out and the approach you're processing, that it literally feels like you're about to jump off a cliff. But if you're able to go and truly model mistake making, not their kind of mistakes, but our kind of mistakes, it will give them permission that stuff is far smaller swamps than the big stuff we share. There's an example. It's kind of embarrassing. It's not embarrassing. I guess it's very embarrassing. It was like a year and a half, 2 years ago. So we run our academy, right? And being as aggressive I am, I wanted to show some of the latest stuff. And the only people we show the latest stuff to usually is the military. We found that nobody else even understood human development at this level. So, which is why we kind of bonded with the military at such a different level. And so there's a whole thing, it's called Leadership 360. Anyways, we do this thing. But you know, when you coach someone, one of the hardest things is objectivity, meaning there's baggage, right? Everyone in the audience is only seeing what's happening now. Well, I know the trail of everything from the past. And so rather than coaching just on what I'm seeing, I'm now piecing together patterns and I'm hammering in front of everyone, live coaching, the senior leader and her poor coaching of another female from London. So Boston woman and a London subordinate, both female. So here are in the academy, male CEO, just obnoxious aggression on a senior leader, female leader, coaching another female wrong, right? This thing just lit up. Everyone in the academy, I mean, I got like maybe 60 or 70 ones with just ruthless comments with everyone who was here in our home, you know, pro bono, us pouring our investments in, right? This is somewhere in day 2 of the academy. And I went to lunch with Megan and reading it was very tough. I mean, ashamed, right? As a CEO, I did this. I'm assuming employees were in there too, but academy guests and employees all mixed in. And then we took the advice we give of how to process feedback. I printed it out and you say, take a pen and cross out the things that I believe aren't relevant because maybe they don't know certain pieces. But then take a highlighter and highlight the parts that repeat. And look at that pattern of different individuals seeing the same thing in that short window is a signal that you have to pay attention to. So I look at it and, you know, right now, I mean, my ears are like right at the top of my ears, but we have this thing which is sleep on it. So like face the truth of feedback, then sleep on it. The next morning, revisit that feedback. You will still feel emotionally, you know, tense and on edge, but you will find greater pearls of wisdom. So go through the same exercise. So I took a pen, did the same thing, and it looked exactly the same. And so the next day, as the academy is going, I decided to call an audible. It's telling Megan, texting all night, that I'm going to share this with the whole academy, my process of processing this feedback. And I started by showing a picture of my 2 kids at the window saying, Dad, have fun at work, good luck at work. And I was telling them, I don't want to go to work. I want to call in sick today. I don't want to go to work. There's a picture of them waving at me. And then I pulled out my feedback and I showed them the exact process I went to. I showed them like kind of what we talked about, how ashamed I was and how, I mean, and I was physically bawling and shaking as I was sharing this, like not planned whatsoever. And it was like, it was so hard to do because my intent was to be helpful, which is why I put this thing in the first place. And then, you know, you got caught up in a certain situation and, you know, everyone, we have our narratives of why we do something. When we do this, we all have our own narratives. And it was such a tough thing to share. But when you do something like that, which is my swamp, it gives everybody else permission, authority to process their swamps with greater courage. And at the end of the academy, they went around and they talked about what they took away. I think the resonating theme was you gave me courage to get ones on feedback.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think the millennials are in a different generation. It's a part of not fighting that. And I think one of the challenges we've had is we want to show them the swamp and it's messy, but then you need to show them how to win. You need to show them what it looks like when you get on the other side. You show them, I just went through this and I got better. And that, because if you just go up and talk about the bad, they're going to be like, I don't really want to follow this leader anymore. You've got to be able to show them. And I think the hardest times we've gone through in the business is when we're struggling, we're flat, turnover, is to talk about those things in front of the company for fear that more people might leave, depending on what we say, or but then to show them how we fight through the other side.
Right.
That victory, and we call it the press. When you get to the other side, you're on the other side of the swamp. To be able to talk about both is really important. It's the modeling, the mistake making, but modeling what it is to be awesome.
But this is the whole
You have to do
balance
both.
notion.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hear from losers how well they process losing. You need a win. The mission that absolutely matters. In the same way, if you're coaching millennials, right, through this, but you don't even have one success story, trust me, no one's going to listen. Our turnover shutdown when success stories showed up is when they said, oh my God, their obnoxious aggressive coaching me was actually producing these individuals. And they went up and shared this tough love that they got and what helped them get here. It's amazing. And you have 1, 2, 3 more and more examples. Next thing you know, you get a tipping point.
You can find the influencers in that group. There's influencers who are usually a little snarkier. You get them on your side, it's game over. And I think generally speaking, I really do feel like for them especially, it takes consistently modeling what that looks like of swamp and press, like swamp and win.
That's another one of those things. Sorry. Sorry. You got something to go?
I think the how and the why matters, though. I think millennials have to understand that. And then it's the fundamental difference, I think, is that you can just show them the how and the why. They'll buy in, but they will not buy in if they don't see the how and the why.
But what we found was this: the why was around 5% of the equation. The how and the what was around 95. And the reason is this: most people don't succeed because they don't want to. They just don't know how. And so many of the moves, like the hurting your foot on the right, or even figuring out how to get out of the swamp, you got to go deeper in, which is harder and so counterintuitive. If you see the movie Ready Player One, the whole life thing, right? So I'll ruin the room movie a little bit. They had to learn to go backwards. That's so counterintuitive that they want to do it, but they're so pressured through society and cyber and internet, whatnot, to go a certain path. But to show them and model this other paths that exist is actually what they need. And that's usually and oftentimes the more effective and faster path, but it's counterintuitive. Good.
I want to turn the floor over to the Marine Corps War College for a moment.
So, thank you, Charlie. Thank you on behalf of the Marine Corps War College. This has been a really different presentation. So, normally I come up and I say how you guys were, and this is the most incredible thing we've ever seen. But you just said that we shouldn't do that. So, I'm going to start with your monkey fish picture, and I think you missed something in there because after more than 2.5 centuries of this organization, we are born in the amphibious world, right? So the animal that picture is missing is salamander. Right? And you hired a Marine, so maybe if you could put a little tiny salamander in the photo, that would be perfect. Actually, thank you so very, very much. This has been invigorating. We've been spending a lot of time talking about cognitive dissonance, and I am the obnoxious, aggressive guy, and you got me thinking quite about some things. So I think that you probably got everybody in this room who's way smarter than you doing the same thing. Thank you so much for your time and effort. Fantastic. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
So Binky, my grandfather's 94, Sergeant Major Binky. He was a Marine. Paris Island, 1942. And he just told me recently, I might take a picture of you guys. He recently, I just saw him last weekend in Boston, and he said, you know there, Megan, I've been going to the Marine events for a long time. He dresses up. He's like the best. He's amazing. And he said, but I don't go anymore because all my friends are dead. So I thought I would take a picture of you guys, as Charlie usually does, to show them that his friends are not dead. If I could do that. So I'm just going to take a picture. I wish you were in uniform, but it's close enough if you don't mind. Thank you. I'm going to send this to Sergeant Major Bink. He's going to love it. Thank you so much for coming. This was amazing to have you all.